Tell me a little bit more about this transition though, where like obviously you're very quantitatively apt, and like I'm sure you crushed it on a lot of the modeling and a lot of the quantitative elements in finance. But there's also elements of like decision making and ownership that come out in finance careers, where that's not really the case in engineering a lot of the times, where it is mostly about like the technical problem solving and the very, very intellectual efforts. And so what was the sort of proof point where you realized that it was going to be interesting to do something outside of that technical problem solving?
Yeah. It was my first ever internship, which was after my freshman year. I was working at a heat exchanger and thermal oxidizer manufacturer, which don't worry, it's basically just
Not even
big
gonna ask.
machinery that they worked on. And yeah, we don't need to get into it. But the I remember distinctly being the person that was kind of poking through the CAD design, and CAD is, for those that don't know, is like this automated visualization system online where you can kind of see the design and make adjustments as you need for folks to then later go and print it and manufacture it. And so I remember I was spending a lot of time on this CAD design, and I would ask my boss, questions about the broader business. How many of these are they selling? Why does the client want this product in the first place? Is there a way for us to maybe sell a few more, or like how do we price it, or all these kinds of questions that I think I realized I was more curious about than just the technical elements of like how does this heat exchanger work and how many pieces do we need to fit this model. And so at one point I think he kind of got sick of my questions and was like, honestly, I have no clue. I just build what I can and I go home at 5 and I make my paycheck. And when I heard that, that's when I sort of knew it wasn't for me. I was like, if that's the sort of 30 years fast forward of this job, which again, to be fair, don't mean to sort of disparage that in any way, but I think that that's
Yeah.
just not what I was looking for out of my career. And so I decided that was kind of not for me.
Well, that's totally fair. And like for many people, 9 to 5 and like focusing on an interesting problem and like doing something they like, that's a great outcome. And obviously, I don't think either of us are disparaging that. But a lot of the students that I really, really enjoy working with are the ones who like kind of, I liken it to them being like a border collie, where if you lock them up in an apartment, they're going to chew through the couches unless they have something to do 24/7. And so the best people in finance are border collies in my mind. You have to have a lot of energy, a lot of commitment. And the same thing applies for consulting. And so that kind of brings us to our next chapter here, where you went from this engineering background to Bain, like absolute incredible consulting firm. Everyone's heard of it. Everyone knows how cool it is. Everyone knows how hard it is to get those positions. And so I really want to dig into what pushed you towards consulting specifically. And just as to reveal my bias, like I was a banker, I went to Lazard, I went to Catalyst, and I personally think that banking is the best career to start out of school. Give us the opposite side. What's your pitch on consulting?
I love that that's your perspective. I think we can get into a good debate here. Well, so look, let me caveat before I get into that, which I have very strong opinions on why consulting is better. But we can talk about it. The I will say I did do an investment banking internship my junior year summer, and so had a little bit of a flavor for what comes with the investment banking world. And so part of the story of going into consulting starts with the investment banking internship. And first off, I would say very, very clearly, I think an investment banking internship for a junior year summer is just about the best internship you can have, no matter what. If you want
We
to go
agree.
into this industry,
We agree.
I know we agree on that one. And the reason for that, and I'd be curious to get your take, but the reason for that is, it's hard in an 8 to 10 week period when you're a junior in college to really come away from an experience with skills that you can say you are an expert in or better than 90% of the people that are in your age group in. And I think I came away from banking, at least from a technical standpoint, on Excel, on PowerPoint, even just on understanding some basic accounting concepts and how businesses work and how they raise capital and how M&A works. Frankly, you're just it's a weird way to put it, but you're spending so many hours in this internship. You're doing 2x the work or 3x the work probably
Yep.
of like someone else doing a more standard internship. And you get so much more out of that I think at that point in your career, the value that you come away with, no matter what you want to go do in business after, a banking internship is extremely, extremely valuable. So I came away from it loving it, would never regret it. I don't know. Did you feel that same way? I would imagine you did because you went back into it. But curious.
Definitely, I definitely wouldn't say that I necessarily loved it. I appreciate it. Sort of the same way that I had a cross country coach in college or well in high school, and he would always yell at me and be like, Max, you're running too slow, you're going too slow, go up the hill. Like, why aren't you running up the hill? And I didn't love it, but I appreciated it. And that's the same thing with investment
Yeah.
banking, where a lot of the time it's like it is extraordinarily challenging. And like there were a couple times when I like literally thought I was going to die of sleep deprivation, but I learned so freaking much, like you were describing. Like I learned the Excel, I learned the PowerPoint, I learned the finance. I was working twice as much as a lot of my peers, but I was learning probably 3 times as much. And so it really was a good trade off. But flipping it back to the full
Yep.
time decision, you did the JP Morgan
Yep.
internship, which, by the way, you're being modest. You didn't mention it was freaking JP Morgan, which is an incredible offer, incredible bank. So, what led you to like turn that down? Because you got the return offer, which is very hard to do at an incredible bank. Like, why would you turn that down?
So two reasons, and it was a tough decision, but two reasons. One, I was in J.P. Morgan's oil and gas group. I went to Rice for undergrad. Houston was really the only place we could go, and I was in an energy group that in a lot of ways was going to be siloed from the rest of the industries. And I just thought that my background was chemical engineering. I was in an oil and gas group. I was basically going to pick an industry before I had even really had the chance to learn what other industries were out there. So one thing that made me hesitate was just the laser focus on the industry, and then the second thing that made me hesitate, and this may be where we can be a little contentious, but I I thought that the investment banking analyst program was way over indexed to
Mm-hmm.
hard skills and analysis more than it was to building soft skills.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that was overly simplistic, but I remember talking to first year and second year analysts and thinking, wait a second, like the way you guys get really, really good is you're spending your extra hours from 1 a.m. to 3 a.m. iterating on a model so that when the time comes, you are ready to absolutely crush the model and
Mm-hmm.
be the person that is trusted to go do that. And I was like, that is extremely valuable. But if I fast forward 20 years from now, do I want to be the person that's the model guy? Or do I want to be the person that can build a relationship, that knows how to work plan, that knows how to build like sort of work a team and make sure a team is allocated and assigned the right way? Do I want to be able to communicate effectively, complex ideas? And I just thought that those were skills that I wanted to start learning earlier rather than later. And so my sense was across those two things, the way that I solve it is by going over the consulting side. Because consulting, I would be working in a bunch of different industries, and a lot of times you are spending half of your job essentially on the softer skill side. How do you communicate with a client? How do you present the right way? How do you sort of build yourself as a
Yeah.
professional with a client facing role when you're a young person? So that's the thought process.
That's fair. That's fair. I want to come back to that second point, but to your first point, so you're saying like it was about silo into ONG, and then it was also the soft skills component. The oil and gas one, I definitely get, and I'm very curious once we get to this chapter at Apollo where you were working in climate finance and climate P, if there was an element where you're like, I don't want to work in oil and gas, but we can get there. The second piece though is about the soft skills, and I think this is a really critical distinction that a lot of folks get caught up on because I totally agree with you. Like I think that long term, every job is a sales job. Like investment banking is a sales job. Private equity, sales job. Consulting, sales job. And so it is about those abilities to build trust and build relationships with people and like get to know them and like them. Now, the area where I disagree with you is that like one way or another, if you're going to be successful, like you're going to have to develop that skill. And that's really, really important. But I also think it's just going to happen. Like if you stay in these industries long enough, and if you are going to succeed in these industries, like you're going to have to learn that. Now, the difference though is that if you go fast forward to like a consulting partner who didn't get that technical skill set, they're never going to get the technical side. And so personally, if you're someone like me who thinks that the combo is the technical and the qualitative, like the social and the IQ sort of things, then realistically, I think that it's better to do the technical beforehand, sort of like eating your vegetables before eating your dinner. Now, we can disagree with that. They're obviously both important. And I think that you can't go wrong if you did start out at JP Morgan. Like clearly you were able to get enough of both to succeed. And so my advice to anyone who's not sure about consulting versus banking is remember what Ashish just said a minute ago, where consulting is not the move for your junior summer internship. You can always go do it later. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think good summary. Good summary.
Okay, love that, love that. So you landed at Bain, again, incredible firm, very competitive to get to. What surprised you most about that work compared to what you were expecting going in?
Yeah, I think this is a nice sort of segue from what we were just talking about. But two things. The first one is I didn't appreciate how focused Bain was on doing things the quote unquote right way. And what I sort of mean by that is, especially coming out of an undergrad where this is sort of your first real career, and you are learning not only how to do a new job that is fast paced, you're traveling a lot, all this stuff, you're also learning how to be a professional. How do you write emails the right way? How do you communicate timelines and deadlines effectively? How do you make sure that everyone knows what you're doing and when you're doing it, and are prioritizing the right things? How do you, even when you run into a roadblock, how do you communicate that situation and handle it? And so I think while I'd heard Bain was a great like learning grounds, I didn't really appreciate what level that was at. Bain every 2 weeks you had a dedicated mentor that would check in with you and would give you what we called a PD review sessions, professional development, where they would go through a 15-box checklist of various things that you were doing well, you were doing not so well, and then giving you opportunities to test those out. And it was very structured. It was checked in on all the time. You were constantly measured. And I hated it in the moment because I was like, oh my, I feel like I'm not doing, well. And I feel like, there's always more room for improvement and yada, yada, yada. And everyone else around me is doing so great and all this stuff. Looking back on it, I realized like that sets your bar so high, especially at a time where you're building formative skill sets to be a professional.
Yeah.
That is the whole reason that I almost dedicate a huge amount of my success later on, because I learned how to do things the right way, and someone else was so invested and focused in my success. So that's one thing that surprised me, is I didn't really appreciate how much they would invest on those kinds of things. The second thing, which inevitably led to the demise of my career in consulting, was that I didn't appreciate just how much of the job that we were doing in consulting was convincing the client that we were doing a good job. I'd always thought, hey, if I'm going into consulting and I am a great problem solver and I understand business and we are all really smart people and we're going to get the best product out there, everyone's just going to believe us, right? They're going to be like, wow, these guys are so smart. Like, we trust them. We're paying them so much money. They'll just do it immediately. That is just not at all how the industry works. Half of the job is doing really, really high quality work. And I believe it was really high quality work. But then the other half of the job is understanding how you communicate that with a client that is, frankly, oftentimes very averse to bringing someone else in who is all rah rah, went to some business school and thinks that they know how to do things better than someone that's worked in the industry for 20 years. And so I think that while there are a ton of great skills associated with learning how to communicate those things effectively and work with people that are a little bit tough to work with, it did get a little bit frustrating at times. And I was like, look, at some point we're doing great work. I just want to own the outcome. I don't want to sort of have this just be something that we're advising, and who knows if it's actually going to pan out into something valuable.
Yeah. I want to repeat that, because that's a very important point where it's like, I believe you said, I didn't appreciate just how much consulting is convincing the client that you're doing a good job. Like, that's kind of frustrating in some ways when that's the thing, because you want to be focused on these problems. Like, you're an engineer, you want to like actually solve things as opposed to solve things and be like, hey, by the way, I solved it. And again, it also does come back to that sales thing that we were just saying, where all jobs at the end of the day are sales. And so to the extent that you don't have that skill set to communicate that as effectively as possible, like, you're going to be spending so much more time convincing people that you're doing a good job than actually doing the job. And so that's kind of why it's important to get good at those EQ skills. Now, yep. I also love that first point about like how consulting is very good about focusing on doing things the right way and developing community or like habits and tracking and professional development for students, because that's something that like banking frankly could learn from. Like, I had to ask for the feedback myself a lot of the times between the annual reviews or the semi-annual reviews, and 6 months is a huge amount of time in your first amount of time out of college to not be getting feedback. And so I love that they're so structured. And I'm curious to hear, what about that structured thinking has been helpful for investing? Like, have any of those sort of frameworks or those classic like consulting jargons or ways of doing things transferred into your work in investing?
There are so many, and this is also where I start to land a little bit more strongly on consulting. Lends well to investing down the line, maybe a little bit more than banking, but again, we can debate that for a while. So let me start with a couple big ones, and then I can tell you a couple of Bainisms that also were great. So the first one that I think was absolutely the most valuable was learning how to take a very ambiguous problem or question. So for example, something like, what is the market growth CAGR for scaffolding work at hospitals, and how does it break out in terms of price growth and volume growth, right? Like, there's no data set out there that you can just go pay a company to basically give you percentages and then grow from it. You actually have to be thoughtful about what are the trends that are driving each of those factors, really understand what the scaffolding industry is, understand how the hospital industry is growing, all of that, and then piece it together to come up with a thoughtful, data-driven answer. Mm-hmm. To do that, you have to be scrappy, To do that, you have to understand what data is out there. To do that, you have to understand really what impacts businesses and understand what's most important. And so I think learning that over and over and over again and getting that drilled at Bain, just purely from like a work content standpoint, was super valuable because in private equity investing, oftentimes you have even less time than you did in consulting to get answers to these questions. You need to really understand what the most important things are and then spend the most time on those things, and then not worry about the rest. The Bainism I'll associate with that is 80-20. And that'll come up a lot. And we always talked about 80-20. I don't think it's just a pure Bain thing, but we always brought that up. Is it was an excuse to sort of not boil the ocean on a lot of things.
Yeah.
The second thing that I had mentioned, and I don't know if did you have a comment there?
No, that makes sense, and I think that it's an excuse not to boil the ocean, but that's not like a bad thing. Like I think a lot of people will say, "Oh, I'm going to take the 80-20 as like a way to be lazy," but especially in private equity, since I have done the PE, if not the consulting, it's like you just do not have time to boil the ocean on everything. And if you do that, you're going to miss like 30 emails from your managing director. You're going to like lose process on another deal. You're going to fail to submit an IOI in terms of the bid deadline, and you're just going to fail as a private equity investor unless you take the 80-20. And so I cannot agree with that more. But yeah, tell us more of these Bainisms. I like that word.
So the other thing that I think you learn very quickly is, it's the Bainism is a Bain ever lets another Bainey fail, and you are one of the things I really liked was that if you are, I like to use the word janitorial in a way, in that like you are willing to do whatever it takes for the entire team to get this across the finish line, whether it's jumping onto someone else's work stream, whether it's working a little bit on a Friday night to help a friend out because they have something else going on or got a bunch of work that came their way. If you are a great team player, you are absolutely rewarded for it. And that's something that I think in a lot of ways kind of goes the other direction, especially early on in your career, is that you get taught that like, hey, as long as I'm the one that's sort of beating out the rest of the people that are around me, I'm doing well and I got my career. That's just not how it works in the long run. I think Bain really, really taught me that like helping others, and if people see that the people around you are doing better just because they're around you, you get a ton of credit for doing that. And I think that's just always how it should be. The third thing that I would mention is communication is critical, right? In this job at Bain, let me go to investing. So in the investing job, oftentimes what you're doing is you are communicating to an investment committee of folks that are deciding whether they want to invest in a deal or not. They've oftentimes spent 1%, maybe 0.5% of the time that you have spent on this deal. So you really need to understand, one, what are the most important things to share with them? And then two, how do you communicate that to them in a way where it really, the key points really soak in with the way that they think about the world. And so at Bain, it was very, very similar, but it was at, I would say, a much smaller scale. If we were doing a sort of cost removal analysis, so we were starting to think about how do we like think about negotiating different suppliers and contracts with suppliers. I'm not going to walk through with the head of procurement every single piece of information or analysis that I did. I'm going to tell them, here's how much I can save them. Here's the step 1, step 2, step 3. Here's how we can go handle it. And like I learned pretty quickly that like you need to understand from the perspective of the person that is senior and trying to think about big time decisions, how do I communicate what matters most to them and save them the most time? And so that becomes a very, very critical role throughout your career, but especially in investing, because that's where a lot of people make their careers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's fun when you're saying 1% or 0.5%. I just got thinking, I was like, yeah, it actually is probably about correct, because if you're taking a deal to investment committee and it's like 20 or 30 minutes of discussion, you probably spent like 60 hours in the previous week or two, you alone, working on this deal, if not more, sometimes hundreds. But that's a kind of a funny ratio where it's like you really do have to do a lot of work to show up credibly and make sure that you're saying nothing wrong when you are talking with these people who are so busy and their time is so freaking valuable. But I'm gonna hold you to this sort of like parallel between consulting and PE, because clearly you did make the transition in the long run to private equity. And so were there moments at Bain when you realized that you didn't want to just be an advisor, you didn't want to just be that consultant, and you did in fact want to own the outcome a little bit more, get the skin in the game, as they say in private equity?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know that there was a specific moment, but it was the exact reason that I wanted to leave was around this owning the outcome piece of it. I about a year into my time at Bain, I was in their private equity commercial due diligence practice. So essentially what they do is the private equity firm will be looking at a new deal in a new industry, and they'll hire a company like Bain to come in and obviously do market level research, understand how the market is growing, what's the size of the market, what are the value creation opportunities, what's the competitive landscape, all that good stuff. I was probably in my fourth or fifth commercial due diligence for a major private equity firm, and at the time I sort of stepped back and was trying to reflect on the first couple of diligences that I had done, and I realized I had no clue if the client did the deal or didn't do the deal or had executed the plan or not. And I was just like, what, I'm spending hours and hours and hours of time. And frankly, I really liked it. I was very excited about the answers that we were giving, but then realized like, I actually have no idea if any of this is actually making a difference in the world. It could just end up being words on a PowerPoint page that we have no clue that gets executed on. And so I think that became frustrating very quickly. And as I did more and more diligences, I sort of realized, hey, no, this is not exactly the right place for me. I think in consulting, you get a seat at the table, but you don't get to make the decision. In PE and investing, you get to make the decision, and you get to hear from the folks that are at the table. And so I just wanted to be on that side of things more.
Gotcha. Okay, so we're about to shift over to talking about your stint in private equity, starting with Golden Gate Capital. But before we get there, the last question I'm going to circle back on something you just said, which was about the communication. We were talking about like how important it is to communicate effectively with these executives and stuff. Because something that's similar between consulting, banking, and private equity is that you, as a 20-something, are talking with probably a 50-something who's a CEO of a business. And so you're speaking with people who are twice your age, 3 times your age, extraordinarily accomplished, and frankly, a lot of the times don't have much patience for bullshit. And so how did working with executives at Bain shape your communication style? And like, did you learn anything that can be transferable in terms of how to communicate effectively to these senior folks?
Yeah. Number one thing is every point of communication is all about building a relationship, right? And how you communicate contributes substantially to what that relationship will look like a year or 2 years down the line. I think in private equity, the most common time where you're communicating with a bunch of different management level members, CEOs, CFOs, et cetera, is oftentimes during a diligence process where you're trying to understand what's going on with the business. You've got a bunch of data on the business. And frankly, in PE, you're looking for weird trends, and you're trying to almost get an explanation or understanding for why things might go wrong. And I think navigating that conversation with people that are in the weeds of this business, have dedicated their entire lives to building these businesses, is so important, because that can go so wrong if you are just nitpicking and not understanding and not communicating or asking questions with the right intentions in mind. And so one of the things that I learned very early on in consulting is building that relationship and focusing on content and understanding how do you say things in a way that is not disparaging or condescending or anything like that, but giving people the respect that they deserve for the work that they've put into the business, saying thank you, being very much so a person and a human being, over being overly business and trying to almost say, hey, I know what I'm talking about. I know business. Trust me. Like that never really works. What works is like you telling them like, hey, I'm a person too, and I'm there with you. And we're just trying to work together to get to a better answer. And I think that like at the end of the day, and Max, I'm sure you agree with this, like to your point around, all of these industries being sales jobs, they're all about building relationships. They're all about people. And like you have to figure out how do you manage people. And that doesn't mean you always need to be nice. It doesn't mean you always need to sugarcoat. You can say things in a very direct way as long as the person, you've built enough of a rapport with the person to show them that you're asking a direct question for the benefit of both of you. So I think understanding how to do that, like when I'm 22 or 23 years old with folks that are 40 or 50, and when you have almost no ability or no clout to say anything, and as you get a little bit more older and later in your career, you do have a little bit of that you can flex a little bit, but learning how to do that at a young age like helps so much, especially nowadays when you're starting to build these relationships with CEOs and partner with them in the long run.
Gosh, I wish I'd heard this a few years ago, because this is like absolute gold dropping from your mouth right now. And it's something that I've made a lot of mistakes on personally, because especially in like banking, they're training you to like be a bulldog, just like chase the number, get it right, get it perfect, like move fast, move hard. You're working a 100-hour week. You expect everyone else to work just as hard, just as fast. And what I didn't realize about investment banking is that relationships are a piggy bank, and you've got to like make deposits before you can take out withdrawals. And I experienced this actually pretty clearly while interviewing for a firm just about earlier this year, in fact. And I was doing the interview, and we did a few minutes of small chat talk, like we were chatting, and I pretty quickly was like, well, yeah. So, anyways, I'm super excited to like talk about the business and see how I can help and see if there's a potential fit here, yada yada yada. We went on and had a good interview. It was great, but I got dinged. And so I went back afterwards and I was like, hey, like, I really enjoyed our conversation. I thought it went well. Like, I'd be curious if there was any feedback for me. And the guy said to me, he said, Max, there's two things wrong with our interview. And the first one is that you cut the small talk. Like, I was just trying to get to know you as a person. Like, I wasn't here to like learn if you could do a DCF. I knew you could do a DCF. I knew you could do finance. I knew you could do business. But the question was, like, were you a person? Like, were you willing to connect with me and build those relationships? Like, and I didn't prioritize that and therefore got dinged from the process. And so that really bit me in the butt. And then the second one is an even more important piece of feedback that I'm going to take with me literally to my grave. He said, Max, the biggest problem with your interview was that you typed too loud the entire time. So get a softer keyboard. So make sure that when you're doing interviews, you've got like a quiet keyboard so it's not just clacking away in the background.